Welcome, welcome. Wonderful to see you. Oh, hello. I see dear friends from UX days. Great to see you. Fabulous. Welcome, welcome. I'm Raquel Holmes. I'm with the Freedom Festival. I'm so excited to welcome you both to Let's Learn and the class of Freedom Makers, Maroons, and the Underground Railroad. And we'll be having even more people joining us as we go along. It's so exciting to have you here. Welcome again, and so beautifully on time. I wonder if people at the moment could, even in the chat, we're going to use the chat just for a little bit, as we go into this event, just say, where are you? Where are you? And how did you learn of this event? So, like, I'm in Cotati, California, and I learned of the event both from Freedom Festival and Let's Learn. Oh, I love Jennifer's in Boston, Mass, and she's a volunteer with the Freedom Festival. And if it's hard to chat, feel free to unmute and say. And we might speak over each other for a moment. That's okay. Lebanon, wonderful. And an email from Dan via Let's Learn. Lovely to have you here, Christelle. Beautiful. Thank you. Exciting. Bellevue, Washington. Saw it on Facebook. Fabulous. Woohoo. Excellent. Brooklyn, New York. I won't be able to read them all. Battle Creek, Michigan, home of Sojourner Truth and on the Let's Learn mail group. Exciting. Los Angeles, Let's Learn. Dr. Barlow, fabulous. Wonderful. We have Brooklyn, more Brooklyn, beautiful Brooklyn. Excellent. So excited. All right. Well, and Anne Green, I recognize you. We have Vivian White from Berkeley, California. She learned of this from the Edions and Sonoma State Friends. In no state, no worries. You don't have to share your video. Excellent. Go ahead and keep letting people know where you came from or where you are and how you came here. I'm going to give us a little introduction. So again, I'm Dr. Raquel Holmes. I'm the initiator of the Freedom Festival. The Freedom Festival is an event that takes place, an activity that takes place from June 19th to July 4th. And in the upcoming, just in this, the upcoming events for the Freedom Festival include today, the Freedom Makers, Maroons, and the Underground Railroad, but also an opening conversation with myself, Dr. Jesse Fields, and those who come. These are free events online. There are also in-person events that are taking place and hybrid events, a staged play reading of Juneteenth. The pool party's in Guerneville, California, so you might have to get on a plane for that one. But that's just a flavor of what's happening in the Freedom Festival, which is an invitation for people to explore what emancipation and independence means to us, means to each other, and to do it collectively. So we're doing this in collaboration with Let's Learn, and those of you on the Let's Learn mailing list know this, but let me give you a sense of who Let's Learn is. It's a free global online learning and teaching community. Let's Learn is organized and sustained through the goodwill of those who participate in it. And that's artists, poets, gardeners, cooks, musicians, doctors, nurses, scientists, community organizers. And it's designed for and by people from all walks of life, from all over the world, to share and create knowledge and culture together. So it offers a very diverse range of free online classes and workshops, conversations, and performances. You'll see it's of a very similar family with the Freedom Festival, and we're happy to be partners and work together. So all the Let's Learn's teachers and facilitators are volunteers, which is how it can be free. It has no grades and it offers no degrees. Students attend because they're curious and want to have new experiences, learn new things, and meet new people from all over the world. Its slogan is, "Everyone has something to learn. Everyone has something to teach." Let's Learn. It's a joint project between the Eastside Institute and which is an international research, teaching, and networking center based in New York, which focuses on innovative approaches to education and emotional development and social activism, and Lloyd International Honors College of the University of North Carolina, Greensboro. And this is where undergraduate education is developing through, and I love this, Omar, play, experimentation, and performance. Thank you. And so it is led by Omar Ali, and I'm going to say a little bit more, but you've been watching Omar walk in the forest, which is part of our class today. Go ahead and wave, Omar, as I am going to say a little bit more about you as people continue to come in. So, Dr. Omar Ali is the co-founder of Let's Learn and the dean of the Lloyd International Honors College at University of North Carolina, and is an international renowned scholar of African American history and the African diaspora. And Omar, you were the person who said, when I said, "Oh, I want to do this Freedom Festival after Opal Lee saying, let's celebrate from Juneteenth to July 4th," you said, "You just need one event a day and you have a festival." And that was so inspiring. That was so helpful. And it was true. And we've grown so much bigger than that. So he's the author of 7 books that explore the political and scientific contributions and innovations of Africans and people of African descent. He's a Fulbright scholar. He collaborates with the the chemistry department at his school and many other things. But beautifully, he's created this wonderful tour and journey of the Underground Railroad. And in whatever fashion you can, an emoji, a voice, a smile, a wave. Let's give Omar a round of applause just for organizing, being present, and being part of creating an environment for us to learn. Omar, so glad to be here with you.
Thank you so much.
You're
Can you
welcome.
all hear me okay?
Almost.
Almost? How about now? Can you hear
Yeah.
me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay, great. Thank you very much. It actually just started raining in the forest, and so I'm hiding under a tree. You can see my friend here is protecting me. Um, I think if you aren't speaking, and we'll get to a point where people can ask questions. I would make sure that you're muted, okay? Um, so I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you so much, Raquel. Thank you, Stephen, for helping out with some of the tech. My dear friend and colleague Dan Friedman is actually in another meeting right now, but he sends his greetings. He's the program manager. The World is Classroom, and I'm just thrilled to be part of this Freedom Festival. This is I think the third. And I just love to share some of this history. Everywhere you are, we're connected to world history. Some places have especially interesting stories, but we're all connected wherever you are, in the city, in the suburb, in the woods. And so I'm in Greensboro, North Carolina. It's the middle part of the state. It's called the Piedmont, which comes from the French word the pied du mont, that's the foothills, right? And and it's a beautiful area. We have a lot of pine trees and other trees, but we have a lot of Carolina and Virginia pines here. And what we're going to do over the next about 50 minutes or so, is take a walk through the Guilford woods, which is technically owned by Guilford College, which was a Quaker university that was founded in the 1830s, and it was really ahead of its time in that it had both men and women, and it becomes a location where a lot of Quakers are. And Quakers, for those of you who may or may not know, are Christians. They're one of the denominations, and the one thread of Quakerism were anti-slavery. And so, as early as the 1680s, somebody has their phone on, so you might want to mute if uh, you haven't done so. I'm hearing some.
Omar, I have one other suggestion. If you're,
Uh-huh.
is I think it would be great if we put you in speaker view and
Okay,
let people select gallery if they choose.
there
So,
we go.
yeah, Stephen, if you could do that, that'd be great because we get a better view of the forest and a view in speaker view.
Okay,
Thank you.
that sounds good. Um, so the where we are is a place where Quakers were participating with free African Americans and enslaved African Americans to help launch out of the institution of slavery here in the South to go north, where there wasn't slavery at the time. We're talking about the early 19th century here. So the Quakers happened to have a one thread that was anti-slavery, and actually the first document that is really an anti-slavery document um, in what would become the United States, in fact, in the Americas, really is the Germantown Remonstrance, which was published in the 1680s up in the Pennsylvania area where there were a lot of Quakers. Quakers had migrated down here to make a life, and they were the ones that came here were very committed to trying to get people who were enslaved out of slavery. And so these woods that we're in, and I'll just do a little panorama, um, is in some ways for me, and I think for many people, sort of a sacred place. It's where freedom makers came to self-liberate. The dominant story of abolitionism and anti-slavery has been sort of the white saviors coming in to help Black people. And I think that over the last 20 years or so, there's been more pushback to show Black agency in that process. African Americans didn't need white people to tell them that freedom was a good thing. And quite frankly, need their help all the time. But if they were willing, that's great. And these Quakers were very courageous and joined with free Black people and enslaved African Americans. It might come as a surprise to you that there were free Black people here in the South, in North Carolina. But there's always been a small sliver of free Black people in what would become the United States of America. And the reason why is because under common law, English law, it wasn't clear whether the people that were being enslaved and brought here initially in the 17th century were slaves. In fact, they were technically indentured servants. Indentured servants were people that sign a contract for a period of time and are basically going to pay off their ticket, if you will, to the Americas. But that really pertains to people coming from the British Isles. So there was confusion in the law, like who are these Black people who are de facto enslaved? And it would be a process that's called the terrible transformation. Between 1640 and 1700, there was the racial codification of slavery. So that's a mouthful. Racial, okay, race, codification, just a fancy word for making something into the law. And so Black people and white people were designated different races. This is when race construction was created. And those of African descent were given permanent status as enslaved peoples when indentured servants had a limited time. So you see these laws being put into place as early as 1640, a very famous case of three indentured servants, one African descended, and then two from the British Isles. They together run away because Black and white people work together. Poor and working people actually work together. In many ways, the story of the United States has been the systematic efforts to divide and conquer poor and working people against each other using race as a way of dividing Americans against each other. And so the three run away, they get caught. The two white indentured servants get an additional year contract on their status as the person of African descent is given lifelong servitude, thus establishing the legal foundations for this, what would be called the racial codification for slavery, where anybody of African descent who was enslaved would be for a lifelong status. Slavery looks different in different parts of the world. In this part of the world, we're more familiar with lifelong servitude. In other parts, there was more wiggle room. I do work on the African diaspora in the Indian Ocean. And you have these African figures that rise to tremendous levels of responsibility and power, like Malik Ambar, who was a leader, a de facto ruler in India in the early 17th century. So back to the woods, the free African Americans, and we have the names of some people like Saul, would work together with people like Levi Coffin, who is considered the conductor of the Underground Railroad. And so they worked together and they met here in these woods with enslaved people who wanted to get out, and they planned their launch from here. So let me pause and let me see if you have any questions at this point as I move a little bit closer to the woods. So if you want to put it in the chat, or if you want to unmute yourself, go ahead and ask a question as we walk. And if I'm not going to be able to see the chat, Raquel, if you would do me the favor and read what questions are. Okay.
Of course. What questions do we have? It's interesting, Omar, because I was thinking, I don't know that I have a question, but I was struck by the 1640 creation of the separation of race, separation of indentured servitudes by race, and really establishing a basis for ongoing racism and structure and enslavement. Like, I was like, wow. So I wrote that
Yeah.
one down.
Yeah.
Yeah. What other?
We created this notion of race. Raquel is, for those of you who don't know, she's a biologist, and we know that there's no scientific basis for races. In fact, there is greater diversity in Africa genetically than there is in everywhere else in the world, because we've been longest in Africa, and tremendous diversity in general in terms of language. There's over 1,500 distinct languages spoken in Africa, culturally, and in all kinds of ways. Africa is very diverse, but we glop everybody who is of African descent as Black. And so this is a creation that we made. And I see a question. I can't read it though.
Thank you for saying so. Can you share the name of the Indian king who had an African employee, please? And the name of that African again.
Oh, yeah. His name is Malik Ambar, Malik Ambar, which is Amber, or ARs, depending on the spelling. Malik Ambar. And he was Ethiopian, Oromo specifically, and was enslaved and then taken to Baghdad, and then makes his way to India, where he would rise to power as the de facto ruler of one of the sultanates of Ahmednagar. And he wasn't alone. There were many Africans who were part of this military slave system that would rise in power. So that's his name, Malik Ambar. I wrote a book on him.
And then who wrote the German anti-slavery document? Also, there are
Yeah.
some so longer. Also, there are some historical documents that support the original American Indians being misclassified as Black African Americans, and both groups actually being the same group with changed names. What's your take on that? Dynasty asked this.
Okay. Well, race has been variously constructed, and in many places there was concerted efforts not to include Black people with Native Americans, and in other places where they were sort of globbed together. There's a lot of politics around the inclusion or the exclusion mostly of people of African descent from Native American groups. But you have to remember that even just before the outbreak of the Civil War, what constituted being Black differed across the South. In some states, it was whether you were one quarter of African descent, in others 1/8 or 1/16 or 1/32. So, in some ways, race is a very fluid construction, and it's based on power. Who has power and authority can determine the racial classifications. And in world history, it looks very different. In some places, what was more of a defining characteristic was not your phenotype, right? What we take as Black or white or other backgrounds, but your religion, right? So in the Indian Ocean world, just to go back there, it was much more important if you were a Muslim or if you were a Hindu or if you were a Christian or if you were a Jew than if you were presenting phenotypically as Black or white. Yeah. I don't know if I answered everything. There was maybe another question.
Well, I think that was the question. Oh, who wrote the German anti-slavery document?
Oh, yeah. So it's called the Germantown Remonstrance document, and it was done by Quakers in that Germantown area of Pennsylvania. So that was who wrote that, and I believe it was in around 1680, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. And there was a bit of an investment. What's that?
We have the comment of very insightful. But how do you spell
thank
remonstrance?
you.
How do you spell remonstrance?
REMONSTRANCE, I believe. Remonstrance. I believe that's correct.
That sounds
good. Yeah. So where we are is actually a little bit of a site where Guilford College, remember that's the college that owns this forest, which is about 350 acres. And I have the tremendous honor and privilege to live literally just on the woods. So our house, the backyard is the woods. I have now an 18 and a almost 17-year-old Pablo and Samina. And when they were small, they just thought that the entire woods was part of our backyard, which was kind of awesome for them. But it's a beautiful space that Guilford College is very, very generous in letting the community use and walk around. And so they invested in actually creating a little bit of a space here. There's a beautiful mural that you can see here. I'll show you that was created. And also there is now a bridge right over here, if you can see that, that is really new. It's actually just within the last few months that they built that, because we used to have to hop over this little creek here in order to get to the tree if you were on this side of the woods. And then there's an educational spot here that shows some of the fugitive ecologies. It's a little like marker. And this is all very new. And many people who are in the neighborhood didn't even know that there was this history. And so I really just love to take my neighbors and people in the community, my students. I always, it's there's nothing like learning in situ, that is in the space where something is happening. And so now what we're doing, I'm gonna turn the camera so that you can see where I'm walking, but it's really beautiful here. So I'm gonna go up here. These woods are very much connected. There's communication, between birds.
Oh, you're starting to break up, Omar.
And other animals.
Can't hear you. Yeah. Omar, you might have to. Let's pause for a second and see if your sound comes back.
Okay.
Oh, that sounded good. Right now it sounds good, but let me just say, you said there's communication, and then we heard nothing.
Okay. There's communication across the woods among animals and insects and microbes.
Almost.
Losing you.
Yeah. So there, Omar, what you were saying is there's communication among the trees, the microbes, the animals across species, and yet we're actually not hearing you say it.
I think we might need to move location slightly. Might just keep walking.
Let's try that.
Good idea. Let's try that. Let me see here. Let
And I
me know when you can hear me a little bit better.
better.
How's this? Is this better? Okay, good. It's probably the location. There's underground connection between the trees, and it's through a symbiotic relationship with what's called the it's basically fungi. Okay, the mycorrhizal network. So the tree roots are in symbiotic relationship, extending with fungi, which are basically grabbing some additional nutrients but gaining the sugars that the trees are making through photosynthesis. And I think that it's just this magical relationship where we've discovered, well, biologists discovered about 25 years ago, that the trees are using those mycorrhizal networks to communicate with each other. And so when we think about the Underground Railroad, which was the system, as most of you probably know, of trying to get Africans who were enslaved out, I think about this underground symbiotic relationship in the larger ecology. And we as humans need each other and rely on each other, just as the Underground Railroad required a great deal of communication and, if you will, trust, or else it wouldn't have been possible. How's the audio? Is it okay?
It's much better and it's doing fine. And you have a question.
Great.
The trees look young and thin. Has the forest been subjected to logging in the past?
Yes, there has been logging here. We have a combination where we were, which was older, and in some of this area that we're in right now, they are younger. So you have beech trees that are growing. There's a concept in ecology called succession. And so when you basically have land, you'll have bushes emerge, and then you'll have younger trees, older trees like the oaks and things that will emerge there. And then some of the other trees will sprout out in between. And so there's a whole sort of evolution, and we're part of that. We talk about us and then nature, but we are part of nature. So we're shaping the environment just as the environment is shaping us. There's a concept that the Japanese called tree bathing or forest bathing, which is when you walk through the forest and you're just taking in the forest and sort of the psychological, physiological impact that it has on you. And that's partly why I love coming to the woods, is to share the stories of these incredibly courageous Africans and African Americans in partnership, oftentimes with people of European descent, Quakers, white Quakers, but also just to get out and in some ways breathe in the air that's being produced. So I want to turn and show you what is the symbol of the Underground Railroad here in the Guilford woods. And it's called the Great Tree, the Underground Railroad tree. So let me turn the camera, and you can see here, there's a lot of foliage, so it might be hard to identify. Can you see that tree right in the middle?
Yes.
Okay. It is a spectacular tree that in some ways it doesn't do justice being on video, but it's just a magnificent tree that is very near a creek. So it has great access to water, but not too close to destabilize it, its roots. And about, I guess it's about now 8 years ago, there was money raised to create a little platform over here that you can see that we use sometimes to read and to talk and sometimes create collective poetry. And there's now a sign here, including a QR code to see a little bit more about some of the history. So just to say something about this tree. So at the time of the Underground Railroad, which was basically from 1819 to 1852, that's what we understand that period of time, 1819 to 1852. You have this tulip poplar tree. That's the tree right there. And oh, I see something about quilts here. I'll get to that in 1 second. And the tulip poplar that we have here is a symbol of this freedom struggle of Africans and African Americans. It would have been very small at the time, but now it's a living symbol and in some ways a silent witness, if you will, to this courageous struggle of people. And so the tree, as it turns out, just an interesting fact, is that it's the second oldest tulip poplar that's been recorded in the state of North Carolina. So it's a very large tulip poplar. It's unusually large. And it's surrounded by other trees, smaller trees, that it actually, because remember I talked about the mycorrhizal network and the root system, it's actually helping some of these younger trees around there, which we're inferring from other studies where you have these, quote, mother trees that are helping the younger trees around it, not even their own species necessarily. It's a fascinating thing. So somebody asked about quilts. I didn't get the question. Could somebody read it?
Were quilts used on the Underground Railroad as a signal, or is that just a myth?
That's a great question. It is largely a myth that was created in the early 20th century. In some ways, enslaved people, and by the way, I'm using the word enslaved intentionally because scholars are moving away from using the word slaves exclusively because it signifies sort of like a permanent state of some kind or inherentness. Enslaved signifies it's an activity. It's done to people, right? So an enslaved person. So quilts and the colors wouldn't have been as readily available to enslaved people at the time. They barely, in many cases, had enough to just wear one set of clothes. So they wouldn't have had those colorful fabrics. It's a later development among African Americans, and the idea that quilts were used to signal, was it done in some cases? It may have been, but most historians have in some ways debunked that idea. But there were many creative ways that people figured out how to signal the roads. And one of them, and I'll come to a little tree here that we used as a teaching tool. It actually, unfortunately, there was a nail that was right here, but unfortunately somebody took it out, which was not good. But basically what people would do is when you come to a sort of a crossroads, right? What you do is you wrap your arms around the tree that's in the middle of that crossroads. You go up, like you go up the tree, and if you feel something on one side, a nail, you know that that's the direction you're supposed to go. So this was one of the ways in which people learned how to navigate. Because imagine how scary it must have been. First of all, you're escaping, you're leaving loved ones, friends, people that you're close to, and you're in a land that's not known to you. It's unknown territory to you. You don't know what kind of animals are out there. It's just very scary. And you're in the dark and you're trying to figure out which way to go. So people had to be very ingenious to try to create sort of ways to signal which way to go. We also know about songs that were sung to, in some ways, signal which direction, and also to signal if a person, a slave master, an enslaver, was around, and enslaved people would start to sing a song just to signal. And so, but unfortunately, the quilts, it's a beautiful idea, probably wasn't in some ways used in a systematic way. What's the question, Raquel? What about navigating?
With the stars, the drinking gourd, so the whole,
Yeah,
say something to that?
absolutely. Yeah, I mean, the North Star is a very important signal, as is the case. People from ancient times up until really the modern age use the stars to navigate. I just came back from from Zanzibar, where I took a group of students and we were looking at the dhows, the ships, and the sailors and the technology that they were using, but they were all using, in some ways, the stars to navigate at night. So people did that on land as well. One of the interesting things, thank you for answering. Oh, sure, you're welcome. One of the other interesting things that people talk about, and we actually ran a tiny little study here, is that about moss being growing on the northern side of trees, and that being one of the indications. We did a little study here, and actually it showed statistical, probability that in fact there was more moss growing on the northern side of trees. So that was another way that you could kind of navigate. So people had different ways of navigating, and of course you couldn't have the same roads and same pathways. And there were many ways that people also helped Africans who were enslaved, for instance, with these false bottom wagons, the wagons that had a little space that was just enough for a person to lie down or two people below where they were carrying whatever it is that they were carrying. And so we have examples of that actually in the local museum, Quaker Museum here, of that. So those are some of the ways. Any other questions or thoughts at this time before I read you something?
And folks are welcome to unmute to ask a question as well.
I don't know if my colleague David Aarons is on right here. I think he was going to try to join. But David is an ethnomusicologist, and
He is here.
oh, wonderful! Hi, David. David is an ethnomusicologist. His research is looking at Jamaicans, Rastafarians going back to Ethiopia. And he actually was co-leading the trip to Zanzibar last year, or the year before last. But one of the things I've learned from my colleagues in ethnomusicology is that we have to be mindful of the sounds, right? The sounds in the woods. So it's probably hard for you to hear, but right now there's like chirping, there's a little crackling, there's a sound of wind before there was the rain. But another sound that you may have heard in the middle of the night, or not quite the middle, but in the evenings in the woods, was something that's called the salat, which is the call to and adhan, the call to prayer for Muslims. So about 20% of Africans that were enslaved and came to the Americas were from predominantly Muslim areas. And so a percentage of them would surely have been in this area. And so you might have heard them reciting the Quran, right? Or which is basically prayers, right, as part of the daily prayers. And so you might have heard that sound. Or if they were Christian, they might have sung or hummed a song. Or if they were of other religions, because Africans brought with them their religions, and they oftentimes become merged with other dominant traditions. So traditions like Santeria, Condomblé, or Voodoo, which maybe many of you have heard about, those were syncretic religions mixing Christian religions with Yoruba or other West and Central West African religions. So we would have heard perhaps the sounds of people invoking, prayer as a source of comfort. So that's another sound you would have heard of as part of the mix. Was there a question I missed?
We have three
Okay.
actually. So how did the language then differ from language now?
How did the language then? What do you mean by the language then? Maybe I missed it.
Dynasty, can you unmute and say what you meant by the language then?
Definitely. So I really just mean like what languages were they speaking versus the language we speak now, and also like in what ways did English maybe change? Was it influenced by different cultures? Just anything that you can give to us, please.
Yeah, that's a very good question. Languages are constantly changing. When my kids speak with their friends, I don't understand a good portion of it because they're using new words to signify things. So language is constantly evolving. And one of the great gifts that Africans gave, if you will, to the enrichment of the Americas was not only obviously the labor that was extracted by force, but also the languages, the cuisine, the technology, the scientific insights, the philosophies, the music. And so language looked very different depending on where you were in West Africa or Central West Africa. So for instance, in Ghana, which was one of the places where many Africans were taken out for the transatlantic slave trade, you have various languages that are distinct: Twi, Ga, Fanti. Then you have down further Yoruba, but also Yoruba has different dialects, if you will. So those languages would have been mixed with English or French, or in some cases Dutch, or Spanish or Portuguese, depending on who was the enslaver and who controlled things, as a way of having some kind of lingua franca, which becomes actually Yoruba or Kiswahili, which you have heard about. Swahili is a lingua franca. It's a language that brings together multiple linguistic traditions into one. So African Americans, in some ways, the dialects, the language that is created is a synthesis of multiple linguistic traditions, different cadences, different rhythms, different verb orders, and so it's very, very creative. So that's kind of what it looked like. Yeah. Other things?
Yes, I wonder if Vasuki can unmute and say their questions. And if not, I'll happily read them. Oh, here you come.
Oh, great, but I'm gonna try. So I was asking, I wanted to know more about the tree itself, and how, like, do we know what the age of the tree is?
Yeah.
And how do we know that the tree was on the actual path of the Underground Railroad?
Yeah, those are excellent questions. So how do we know how old the tree is? We know that the tree is about 300, just about 320 years old by the tree rings, right? So they did a core sampling, which you can't see, but it's a long one that is actually held in the library here at the Guilford College, which I've seen. And you do the counting of the rings, right? And so they were able to count out basically about 320 or so tree rings. So we know that it's about 320 years old. It would have been small at the time, right? And we don't know, quite frankly, if this exact tree was used as a marker. But it's in some ways, it's in the vicinity. And we know that this is a specific area where Africans were. And we know that how? Because of some of the documents that we have from that time period. Specifically, I mentioned the conductor, as they call him, the Levi Coffin. He wrote an autobiography, which details his interactions. He wrote it actually 20 years after the fact, because his family was actually persecuted and forced out of this area. And so he wrote about his interactions with Africans. And actually, I wanted to read you a couple of stories of that, if that's okay. So we know about this history through a combination of his autobiography, of runaway slave advertisements. My colleague, Lauren Schwiniger, at University of North Carolina, Greensboro, was one of the people that helped to compile these and other petitions that are digitized. And so you can go in and actually see the descriptions of enslaved people talking about them going through these very woods. And we also know this through oral history, right? The stories that are passed down, songs from that period of time. And there's a little bit of material culture as well. So that's how we reconstruct history, through primary sources, through material culture, and some oral history. So let me go ahead and tell you the story of one person, to give in some ways a human face to this, because we're talking about a lot of history here without talking about some specifics. I mentioned Saul, S-O-L. He was a free African American who worked. Oh, you're welcome, Vasuki. Who worked with Levi Coffin and Vestal Coffin for a time, his cousin, to help organize. We don't have the names of many others because a lot of this stuff had to be really, really hush-hush, or else people could be harmed, right, and revealed. But Levi Coffin wrote some wonderful stories, and I want to share the story of one. Her name was Edie, E-D-E. And Edie was a young African American woman who was enslaved by David and Rachel Caldwell, who were a prominent family here in Greensboro. David Caldwell was a preacher, he was also a physician, and she decided to leave and use her body to protest something that the Caldwells wanted to do, which was to send her to take care of their daughter that had a newborn in Charlotte, which is by car about an hour and a half from here. So imagine it's a long ways to go. So she would have been separated from her family, Edie. And so as a way to protest that and push back, she took her baby and fled into these woods. And she described where she was. And so let me read an account here from that. Okay, give me 1 second here to pull it out.
You're giving us the experience of laying on a bench and looking up at the trees.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So I'm reading here from this account. When Edie learned that she was to go and live with her young master more than 100 miles distant from her husband and children, she was filled with grief and dismay and studied how she might avert the threatened calamity. The night before the time fixed for her start to her new home, she decided to flee to the thickets and hide herself for a week or two, hoping that in this time her master and mistress would change their mind about sending her away and consent to let her remain. Preparing a little store of provisions and taking her baby in her arms, she fled to the woods and found a hiding place in a dense thicket about a mile from my father's house. And that area is basically now there's a Target that's been built where their house used to be. As it was some distance from the road, she ventured to kindle a little fire by the side of a log, for the weather was cool and chilly, and both she and her child suffered from the cold. She made a bed of leaves by the side of a large log and sheltered herself as well as she could from the wind. She had remained in this hiding place for several days and nights when her child became ill from cold and exposure. Filled with fresh anguish at the sight of its suffering and unable to alleviate them, she determined to leave her place of concealment. Her little stock of provisions had by this time given out, and she was beginning to suffer with hunger. She was acquainted with my father's family and knew us to be friends to the fugitive, and resolved to apply to us for help. She made her way to our house. And then what happens is that Edie makes her way to the house with her baby, who's now ill. And she as soon as they open the door and they let her in, they're subject to criminal prosecution. But they did that because on principle, they believed that their job was to help their fellow human and protect. And so Levi Coffin saw this as a young person, as an adolescent. And he was so infuriated that they would do this to her that he decided to march over to the Caldwells and talk to them based on Christian ideas of brotherly and sisterly love, and in some ways trying to invoke their humanity. And according to tradition, that helped to, in some ways, keep her from being separated from her family. Now, Rachel Caldwell wrote in her memoirs that she had in some ways greased the wheels with her husband to make that possible. So there are multiple perspectives on this historical account. What we don't have is actually Edie's account. And one can imagine, that she has a different way of talking about how this transpired and her role in that. So history has different ways what I should say is there are different ways of understanding history based on who you're talking about, and that there are different views on the same event, as is the case. And we know that, if people witness a car accident, they'll often describe very different things that happened. So that's certainly true with historical accounts from years past. So that's the story of Edie, and we know basically that she was successful in not getting separated from her family. She wasn't free, but it's one of those many victories within the larger violent system of slavery. And it speaks to the sort of the contested nature of slavery, that it was an ongoing fight that was between slave masters and those who were enslaved. I have one more account that I wanted to read to you, but any thoughts on that story?
Well, and also just to give you a sense of time, Omar, there's
Okay.
about 7 minutes left.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm
And
yeah. If there
go
isn't
ahead.
a question, I'm happy to go and read the final thing that I wanted to read to everybody, and then we can have an open session and just reflect on this
Yes.
little visit. Okay.
Sounds
So
good.
this comes from the reminiscences of Levi Coffin, and this is actually an image of him. It's hard to see here, forgive me. That's him sitting down there. Um, and he talked about his experience firsthand with runaway slaves. Runaway slaves are fugitives. That's the way that they're described. Another term that's used, it's in the title of this presentation, is maroon. A maroon is a runaway slave, and it comes from the Spanish cimarron. And cimarron were basically runaway cattle. And because of the system of chattel slavery, humans were made to be property. And so the word cimarron, which was cattle, like literally cattle, like running away, was applied to slaves that were running away. And it was anglicized to be maroon. So he says, Levi Coffin, runaway slaves used to frequently conceal themselves in the woods and thickets in the vicinity of New Garden. These woods used to be called New Garden Woods, waiting for opportunities to make their escape to the north. And I generally learned their places of concealment and rendered them all my service in my power. My father, in common with other farmers in that part of the country, because he's now writing about this from Indiana, he's like now away, allowed his hogs to run in the woods, and I often went out and fed them. My sack of corn generally contained supplies for the slaves, and many a time I sat in the thickets with them as they hungrily devoured my bounty and listened to the stories they told of hard masters and cruel treatment, or spoke in language glowing with native eloquence of the glorious hope of freedom, which animated their spirits in the darkest hours. Beautiful, beautiful writing, and just, I think, speaks to, again, the eloquence of these enslaved people articulating their stories. And unfortunately, we don't have the specifics written down, but we know that they were telling stories of Levi Coffin and helping him to keep doing what he was doing in support of those who were enslaved like them. So I think we'll wrap things up, but I do want to say one thing, which is that, unfortunately today, there are literally millions of people that are living under forced systems of labor still. We don't call it slavery, but in fact, that's what it is. People that are part of the sex trafficking business and other forms of enslaved labor. Like in the Middle East, we know people having their passports taken away and being forced to work in construction sites in places like in the Arabian Peninsula. So this isn't just something that happened in the distant past. It's unfortunately something that continues to this day. But we've also made progress in many respects. And so those two things can be happening simultaneously. And Greensboro remains a site for, in some ways, people who are looking for some kind of freedom. We actually have about 150 languages spoken in the public school system because we have many, many refugees that are part of our community. So that's the presentation. Let's take the next couple of minutes or so just to hear any thoughts that you have or final questions. I would love to hear what you think.
Well, why don't we also go to gallery view? I'm going to read you Carol, or Carol, do you want to say your question? And then we'll continue in towards our wrap up. And you may have to go yourself to gallery view, which means you go up to the corner where it says view and click to say gallery. And if you can't do that, that's fine too. We'll just stay in conversation. Yeah.
My question is, where was the nearest Maroon community to North Carolina, where you are?
That's a great question. The most famous large-scale Maroon community was called Dismal Swamp. Well, there's that there was this area on the border of Virginia and North Carolina, close to the coast, and also in Florida, which further south you'd have to go through South Carolina. But those were large-scale Maroon settlements. But my dear colleague Sylviane Diouf wrote a book on the North American Maroons. A lot has been written on the Maroons in the Caribbean and South America. And she wrote this fascinating book that talked about all these Maroon communities that are near plantations. So it could be like a group of, like, say, 4 or 5 people on the outskirts of plantations that had relationships with people who were on the plantations. So there were actually Maroons all over the place across the South because they didn't want to be too far away from their loved ones. But large-scale ones in parts like Dismal Swamp. And to go back to the Native Americans, we talk about sort of these Black Indian Maroons in Florida. So it took many different forms. In other parts of the Americas, like in Brazil, you had Maroon settlements that were literally up to 15 to 20,000 people. So it really ranged in size. In North America, they were much smaller groups.
Lovely. Omar, it's 1 minute left in our conversation. When I realized there was just 8 minutes, I was just like, oh my God, it can't. This should have been 90 minutes. This is so fabulous. You are a wonderful host in sharing information. So what I'd love to do, even in this moment, in addition to saying thank you, and everyone, of course, can applaud and give emoji to Omar for this fabulous historical tour, which even, that language of historical is that we're still creating history, that it is present, it is today, it is not in the past. And I want to invite you all to continue to participate in the Freedom Festival and the events that are coming up. So we have an opening conversation on Juneteenth. Myself, Jesse, and you, and the organizers of the Freedom Festival, which are you, by participation. We hope you'll come. There's a staged play reading, which will be available by streaming to be able to watch. All these need an RSVP. And then also we have the Freedom We Make, Queer Artists on Sound, Struggle in Sanctuary Spaces, which includes an artist from Berlin. The spirit of and discord and harmony that's been in Let's Learn, poetry. There is the invitation for our voices to be shared with each other, your stories to be present in poetry, in conversation. So we hope you will sign up for the Freedom Festival newsletter and come to events and continue to come to Let's Learn, and creating a space where, what is it? What was it? We all have something to learn and something to give, some variation of that.
Everyone has something to learn. Everyone has something to teach.
There you go. Exactly. Let's keep sharing ourselves and our stories. And so glad you could be here.
Thank you,
Enjoy the
everyone.
festival.